The following content may contain visuals that are disturbing, graphic, or sensitive in nature. Viewer discretion is advised. This material is intended for mature audiences and may not be suitable for all viewers. Please exercise caution while watching, and if you find such content distressing, we recommend discontinuing viewing. This disclaimer is provided to ensure awareness and to prioritize viewer well-being.
Hello and welcome. You watching Global Lens on News9 Live with me, Neha Khanna. Our big focus continues to be on the Israel-Hamas war. It is the beginning of the end. That's what Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu claimed on Sunday, as he called for Hamas operatives to lay down their arms and stated the Palestinian group's end was near. The statement comes a little over 2 months after the Israel-Hamas war erupted in the Gaza Strip. In a statement, the Israeli Prime Minister said, and I quote, "The war is still ongoing, but it's the beginning of the end of Hamas. I say to the Hamas terrorists, it's over. Don't die for Yahya Sinwar. Surrender now." He added, in the past few days, dozens of Hamas terrorists have surrendered to our forces. The reference to Yahya Sinwar was to the Hamas leader who is believed to be the architect of the 7th October attack on Israel. The Israeli military, however, has not released any proof of Hamas operatives surrendering, and Hamas has rejected these claims. Almost 1 month ago, Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant had said Hamas had lost control of Gaza. Israel bombed southern Gaza's main city today after Hamas warned that no Israeli hostages would leave the territory alive unless its demands for prisoner releases were met. The terror group said Israel would not receive their prisoners alive without an exchange, a negotiation, and meeting the demands of the resistance. Israel says there are still 137 hostages in Gaza, while activists say around 7,000 Palestinians are in Israeli jails. Israeli strikes hit the city of Khan Yunis in southern Gaza, while Palestinian militants Islamic Jihad said they had blown up a house where Israeli soldiers were searching for a tunnel shaft. The Israeli army reported rocket fire from Gaza into Israel and said fierce fighting had taken place on Sunday around Gaza City and Khan Yunis. Months of intense bombardment and clashes have left Gaza's health system on the brink of collapse, with most hospitals no longer functioning and nearly 2 million people displaced. News agency AFP has reported that it visited the bombed-out ruins of the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza City and found at least 30,000 people taking refuge amid the rubble after Israeli forces raided the medical facility last month. The UN estimates that 1.9 million of Gaza's 2.4 million people have been displaced from their homes, roughly half of them children. Israel had urged people to seek refuge in the south, but after expanding the war to include southern targets, there were few safe places civilians could go to. Humanitarian organizations have continued to push Israel for greater protection of civilians in the conflict. Mapping software developed by Israel's army to try and reduce non-combatant deaths has been condemned as inadequate by Lynn Hastings, UN humanitarian coordinator for the Palestinian territories. She said, and I quote, "A unilateral declaration by an occupying force that patches of land where there is no infrastructure, food, water, healthcare or hygiene are safe zones does not mean they are safe. Only 14 of Gaza's 36 hospitals are functioning at any capacity, according to the United Nations Humanitarian Agency. World Health Organization Chief Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus has said Gaza's health system is on its knees and collapsing. Israel says some 100 of its soldiers have died and around 600 wounded in the Gaza war. They also claim that around 7,000 Hamas terrorists have been killed in the Strip. In another major development, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the Security Council's authority and credibility was severely undermined after the United States blocked a ceasefire resolution on Friday. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken defended that decision. Friday's vote followed UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres' rare invocation of Article 99 of the UN Charter, which allowed him to call a Security Council meeting on an issue that may aggravate existing threats to the maintenance of international peace and security. The powerful tool hadn't been used since 1989. In an interview, Blinken said, with Hamas still alive, still intact, and with the stated intent of repeating 7th October again and again and again, a ceasefire would simply perpetuate the problem. Blinken added the United States was deeply aware of the terrible human toll that this conflict is taking on innocent men, women and children. On Tuesday, the United Nations General Assembly will resume its emergency session on the situation in Gaza after the United States vetoed a UN Security Council resolution on Friday calling for a humanitarian ceasefire. Qatar, where Hamas's top leadership is based, has said it is still working on a new truce. Like the week-long ceasefire it helped mediate last month that saw 80 Israeli hostages exchanged for 240 Palestinian prisoners and humanitarian aid. But Israel's relentless bombardment is narrowing the window for success, according to the Qatari Prime Minister. There are fears of regional escalation, with frequent cross-border exchanges between Israel and Lebanese militants and attacks by pro-Iran groups against the US and allied forces in Iraq and Syria. Yemen's Iran-backed Houthi rebels have threatened to attack any vessels heading to Israel unless more aid is allowed into Gaza. France has said that on Sunday, one of its frigates in the Red Sea had shot down 2 drones launched from Yemen. Hamas triggered the conflict with the deadliest ever attack on Israel on the 7th of October, in which it killed over 1,100 people, according to Israeli figures, and took around 240 hostages back to Gaza. Israel has responded with a relentless military offensive that has reduced much of Gaza to rubble and killed nearly 18,000 people, mostly women and children, according to the Hamas-run health ministry.
As we kill terrorists and fight the terrorists, there is surrender. Those who come out, many people who come out, and some of them are armed, who disarm themselves. But there are many men who come outside, who were in this zone. When we spot a group like this that has come outside and surrendered to us after we have called to them, we undress them because we are worried about explosive belts. It's something we've been doing for years during battle, because we have had incidents where people have detonated themselves upon our forces. So this is a part of the process. During the process, there is also an investigation. During that process, we also discover in the field Hamas members. Not all of them are Hamas or part of a terrorist organization. So what we do is, when the investigation is over, they put their clothes back on. That's what is supposed to happen. And where it didn't happen, we will change the situation to what should happen. Then we arrest those who are part of a terrorist organization and we bring them here for an investigation. Some of the investigations happen in the field, and some of the people who are found not to be part of the terrorist organizations, just citizens who were in the area, are released to the south, where the other Gazans are now. The pictures that were circulated were not the pictures from the IDF spokesperson's unit. We take pictures during the battle, and we will decide what we publish.
Martha, first, we're trying to do everything we can to ensure that civilians are protected, that humanitarian assistance gets into people who need it in Gaza. We are deeply, deeply aware of the terrible human toll that this conflict is taking on innocent men, women, and children, and we're working to minimize that to the greatest extent possible. We are in almost constant discussions with the Israelis about to ensure that they understand what their obligations are, to make sure that we understand how they are using whatever arms we're providing to them, as well as more broadly. I can't evaluate a specific instance in the moment, but I can tell you we're looking at everything.
The suffering of the Palestinian civil society in Gaza depresses us. Humanitarian aid for civilians must improve. Mark and I are convinced that the two-state solution is the only way in the medium term for Israelis and Palestinians to live together in peace.
I'm on my way to Gaza. It will be the third time I go to Gaza. I just met the member of the Security Council and gave them a briefing about the latest humanitarian development. The main reason I will be going to Gaza is to tell my staff that the UNRWA intention is to stay and to find a way to scale up our operation. You know that a few days ago, I have sent a letter to the President of the General Assembly, and I have warned about the risk that UNRWA might not be able to continue to operate because of the civil order breakdown. We hear for the first time that hunger is prevailing in Gaza. More and more people haven't eaten for 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. The last time I went was 2 weeks ago when I visited the vocational training center of Khan Yunis, hosting more than 35,000 people. I could see already firsthand the level of despair, the level of dispossession. People lack absolutely everything. Some of the people are just sleeping on the concrete. Winter is here. We have sewage water. They're struggling to find clean water. They're struggling to have food. And that was 2 weeks ago, before the offensive in the south. Since my colleagues report that again tens of thousands of people have been moved. They cannot go in the shelter anymore. So basically they are in the open air. They are outside.
All right, so where is this war headed? To discuss that, I'm joined on Global Lens tonight by Lev Aaron, Israeli columnist and journalist, Dr. Harel Chori, Palestinian affairs expert at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University, and Major General Sanjay Meston, defense and geopolitical expert, joining us from New Delhi tonight. Gentlemen, welcome back to Global Lens. I will begin this discussion with you in just a moment. Before that, I need to slip into a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We're coming back in just a moment.
जानना है तो देखिए, समझना है तो सुनिए, सीखना है तो पूछिए, और कमाना है तो खरीदिए। जानकारी, सलाह और निवेश सब एक ही सुपर ऐप पर। पैसे का सवाल है तो जवाब है Money9। आजादी पैसे की, अभी डाउनलोड करें।
All right, let's go back to our guests to understand just where the Israel-Hamas war is currently poised. Lev Aaron, if I could begin with you. One statement made by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is making headlines, and not without reason. He says it's the beginning of the end. The exact quote is, the war is still ongoing, but it is the beginning of the end of Hamas. I say to the Hamas terrorists, it's over. Don't die for Yahya Sinwar. Surrender now. Now, you know, Israel claims that many of these Hamas operatives have surrendered in large numbers. Hamas denies these claims. But when your Prime Minister says it's the beginning of the end, as a journalist, what is your assessment of what's really happening on the ground? Because frankly, it is very difficult to have any sort of independent verification of claims made by either side. Whatever information is coming out of Gaza is either from the Hamas camp or the Israeli Defense Forces. When your Prime Minister says it's the beginning of the end, does he really mean that, you know, it's not going to be long before they believe that they've finished Hamas? Or could it be mere bravado? How do you look at it?
Okay, first of all, I'm honored to be here. You know, Henry Kissinger, the late Henry Kissinger, once said, Israel has no foreign policy, only domestic policy. So if we try to delve into Israeli domestic policy, the only consensus that right now we have in Israel is that the command chain of Hamas must be destroyed by the IDF. This is the only thing we agree about. All the other issues, we cannot really find an agreement, even within this government, about what do we want to achieve in 1 year, in 2 years, in the long run. So right now we see that quite a few colonels of Hamas were killed by the Israeli army, and also mayors and lieutenants and so on. But the real bigwigs of Hamas are still intact. And also the chain of command of Hamas in quite a few areas is still there. So as far as I'm concerned, what Netanyahu said is a bit premature.
It is a bit premature, all right. That certainly is, a very important perspective coming in from an Israeli journalist. We can always trust journalists, I guess, to give us an objective perspective. Dr. Harel Chori, please come in here. Lev Aaron says the Prime Minister may have made this statement prematurely. He almost seems to think this is the beginning of the end of Hamas and therefore the beginning of the end of the war. Do you believe that this is mere bravado on part of Prime Minister Netanyahu, who obviously is under pressure both domestically and internationally, with a growing chorus for a ceasefire in Gaza, with even the United States repeatedly reminding Netanyahu that he and his forces have to do more to minimize civilian casualties? Where do you think the Prime Minister is coming from when he says this is the beginning of the end?
Well, hello, Nia. Personally, I think Netanyahu basically wants to, to cut down or to save whatever can be saved at the moment by simply saying to Sinwar what you can hear already from many, many Palestinians, including just less than an hour ago. I saw a really startling video coming out from the Strip with really a poor Gazan saying to Sinwar, surrender, surrender. You lost it with your vicious plan. Look what you brought on us. So you hear a lot of voices like that from the Gazans as well. It's not just a wish of Netanyahu. In military terms, I can see the deterioration of Hamas infrastructure. For example, in the north, just give it a few days, and it won't be the same mighty force they had before the war. Okay. What you saw, for example, in the past few days with those surrenders in dozens is a clear indication. And I will tell you why. Usually people don't talk about it. It's not just about breaking their spirit. It's also the fact that the tunnels cannot be used in great measures. I'm not saying totally, okay, don't get me wrong, but they would at least be able to go south when push comes to shove, and they did not. This tells you that Israel has been able to destroy, for example, the pass to the south, been able to destroy the capability to work and to fight from those tunnels for a long time. So instead, they're surrendering. And this is a clear sign of breakdown. Now, I agree with Lev that it will take time. It will take time, no doubt about it. But I think that Netanyahu basically wants to save what can be saved at the moment, to tell Sinwar, listen, we can end this war by surrendering, give us our kidnapped, and that's it.
Okay, before I go across to our Indian guest, I need to put this question to our Israeli panelists, starting with you, Dr. Harel Chori, also because I believe that you have to leave the show around 8:30. On the one hand, of course, you have the US solidly backing Israel. On Friday, in fact, controversially, the United States vetoed the Security Council resolution calling for, a humanitarian ceasefire, something that even the UN chief has criticized the US for. But on the other hand, there is also this sense that the US is now mounting pressure on Israel, saying you've got to do more to protect civilians. And very interestingly, over the weekend, there was an unconfirmed report put out by Times of Israel, which said that the Biden administration may finally have set a deadline for the Netanyahu government, saying, wrap up your military campaign before the end of the year. You have until the 31st of December. Is there any truth to that? What are your thoughts on these unconfirmed reports that have emerged over the weekend?
As far as I hear, it's not that rigid. I heard those reports by Politico mainly, and I checked.
And Times of Israel. Times of Israel.
I heard it from Politico, probably probably Israeli sources quoting Politico, but it doesn't matter. From the Israeli perspective, from what I've heard, I was told that it's not that rigid, that America has a clear interest that Israel will win this war, and America knows that we're close to a victory. It will take more than 3 weeks, no doubt about it. However, Nia, there is something really contradictory in the way the Americans are putting it. Because on the one hand, they want us to reduce the number, to be more cautious, obviously, and to reduce the numbers of civilians that are, collateral damage. On the other hand, they tell us, but do it fast. How can you do both fast and be cautious about it? It's contradictory, of course. And another really worrying thing is that I think people don't understand that once Sinwar and the rest of the Hamas leadership hears that America, for example, is putting a deadline, they're saying, great, all we need to do is just wait 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, and then we can come out victorious. And this is really something that damaged the efforts, not just of Israel. We need to understand, not just of Israel, but whoever wants this war to be concluded with the full destruction of Hamas. And there are many actors in this area that this is exactly what they pursue. This is exactly what they want, despite of the fact that they will use, tons of lip service. But we can number them. And so I think it's really counterproductive.
I must say that as you make those very interesting points, I agree with you. The American stand has been very contradictory, especially in the last few days. On the one hand, they veto the UN Security Council resolution asking for a ceasefire. On the other hand, they seem to be almost publicly chiding Netanyahu and Israel, saying there's a gap between Israel's stated intention to protect more civilian lives and the reality on the ground. And now these reports about a possible deadline that the US may have set. But let's not forget, it's not just Israel which is under pressure. The Biden administration is under growing pressure at the moment because many are blaming them for what is happening in Gaza, and President Biden has an election to face next year. And it's not just the Republicans who are likely to weaponize this issue in 2024. There are many Democrats who are increasingly uncomfortable with the stand taken by the Biden administration. Let's be very clear about it. Therefore, I think that is what explains the contradictory stand of the United States. Lev, Aaron, very quickly, before I slip into another break, your thoughts on the question that I put to Dr. Chore. Do you believe the reports that suggest that the Biden administration may well have set a deadline of 31st of December 2023, asking Israel to wrap up its military campaign against Hamas by then?
No, I don't really believe. Israel is part of a camp with the Emirates, with Saudi Arabia, with other moderate Sunni countries, and too much is at stake. So rumors are one thing, but in reality, we saw what the Americans voted and vetoed. And I think the deeds are more important than the things that we read in the newspapers.
Okay, very interesting. So Lev is very clear that no, there is no such deadline. Dr. Harel Chore's response has been more nuanced. He finds the contradictions in the American stance unsettling, and he's not completely dismissed the reports that have emerged over the weekend about the Biden administration possibly setting a deadline, asking Netanyahu and the IDF to wrap up their campaign against Hamas before the end of this year. Like I keep saying, these are unconfirmed reports. We have no independent verification of it. I need to slip into a quick break, and on the other side, we'll continue with this discussion, and I will go across to Major General Sanjay Meston, who's been listening in patiently.
The scale of the attack surprised us.
When you get a series of alerts, 16 intelligence alerts, if Maharashtra government at that time had alerted the Coast Guard and the Navy, this 2611 would not have happened at all.
And one of the details they had planned was to use these dhagas to mislead the investigative agencies.
All this was to be presented as a Hindu terror.
So it was a Pakistan operation. The LET was the front end.
As the attacks were on, it was clear that they were planned and launched from Pakistani territory.
For all of those victims of terror that was exported from Pakistan over the years, including but not limited to 2611.
This and more, streaming on world's first news OTT, News9 Plus. Download now.
The scale of the attack was something that we were surprised at. David Hadley was a double agent. The Americans did not want him to be fully exposed, so all that he probably shared with the Americans was not shared with us in terms of intelligence. If we had that, I'm sure that we would have been able to deal with the situation far better.
This and more, streaming on world's first news OTT, News9 Plus. Download now.
He thought he could outlast us. And 1 year later, the evidence is right here in this room.
Who will blink first?
So far from preventing the expansion of NATO, Russian actions have actually resulted in the expansion of NATO.
It's a mess for Russia and it's a mess for the Western world, for NATO and the United States.
Putin is a dictator, and if he loses, that means the end of his regime, and probably of him personally. So he has to keep going.
Year 2, no end in sight. Streaming now.
Welcome back. We're talking about the Israel-Hamas war and where it's headed. Let me now go across to Major General Sanjay Meston. So thank you for your patience. The question I want to ask you is this. Do you believe, like many do, that the American stand on the Israel war of late has been somewhat contradictory, or at least they've sent out conflicting messages? On the one hand, they publicly criticize Netanyahu and his forces for not doing enough to minimize civilian casualties. On the other hand, they go ahead and veto the UN Security Council resolution asking for a humanitarian ceasefire. And now there are unconfirmed reports Israel finish a campaign against Hamas by the end of this month. We don't know how credible these reports are, but what do you make of the conflicting signals that are emanating from Washington?
Neha, good evening, and good evening to the other guests also. As regards the conflicting signals which are emanating from the United States, see, there are two policies. One policy is to give statements for public consumption. And the second statements are, which are purely meant for Israel, which generally are not made public. So Israeli top leadership would be aware, and Blinken and Biden, they would be in touch with Prime Minister Netanyahu as to what exactly is going on. and obviously they would be discussing every day because it is of concern to United States, it is of concern to the rest of the world, and it is also of concern to Israel. Israel also would like to finish the war at the earliest, but yes, it has to achieve its military aims, objectives, which it has stated. So this is so to say whether U.S. policy is confused, or I feel it is not confused. Their aims are very clear. They are giving military wherewithal. They are giving ammunition. The reports are there. So they are very clear that the objectives have to be met. But yes, one thing is very clear. It's a very complex operation. And in this complex operation, unfortunately, there are large number of civilians, or rather the civilians are residing in all the Gaza Strip. Now, collateral damage will be there. So Israeli forces are trying their best efforts in dropping leaflets. They have identified a large number of zones for the civilians to evacuate. Now, imagine the plight of a civilian. On one hand is the air bombardment, the missiles, and the ground forces. On the second hand is on the other hand is the Hamas fighters. So they also would not like these civilians to move out from there. So the civilians unfortunately get trapped, and this is a problem between a regular army and when you're fighting terrorists in this kind of a complex warfare. So what I foresee, you had made a very, the start point was also one interesting issue that this is the end of the beginning. Oh, sorry, you
the
said
beginning of the end, according to Netanyahu. Yes.
Yeah. Now, this statement has got a lot of meaning. And why I state that, Indian Army, when we had gone to capture the Pakistani soldiers in Dhaka in 1971, our Field Marshal Manekshaw, he was General Manekshaw, the chief of the Indian Army, he had dropped leaflets in Dhaka for the Pakistani forces to surrender. Not only that, it was announced through the All India radio and also in the Pakistan radio for the forces to surrender. So this is and we were successful. The Pakistan army realized that they have been isolated, so they have no option but to surrender. Similar messages going on to Hamas by the leadership of Israel to surrender, and especially to their cadres. And this will also make an impact on the civilians, the Palestinian civilians, because they also may now start feeling that they are losing their life, they are losing everything. They are not only life, they are losing their house, everything, their property. Who's to be blamed for this? It is Hamas. So that pressure also may come.
So can I ask you a follow-up question? Since you have specifically talked about Netanyahu's statement saying this is the beginning of the end, you've drawn an interesting analogy with the India-Pakistan war of 1971. Of course, we know how that war ended. But, do you believe that there is merit in the statement or claim being made by Netanyahu when he says it's the beginning of the end? Do you really believe the Israeli Defense Forces actually have Hamas on their knees, or could it be mere bravado at a time when Netanyahu is under tremendous international pressure?
So neither it is bravado and neither it is they are on their knees. It is just pressure tactics. See, after all, let's remember there was a few days pause in which hostages were exchanged. Why did the war immediately resume after about exactly 7 days?
Exactly 7 days.
It was again, Israelis wanted to put military pressure, and military pressure is put in many ways. One is perception warfare. It is also, the announcing that you have to surrender. The fact the South Gaza, the huge operations have been launched. This is again to pressurize them. As it is, if you see today, Hamas has been totally divided into two. One of its forces, very less brigades are operating now in North Gaza. They are totally surrounded. And similarly in the South Gaza, balance of the brigades are there. How many brigades are there of the Qassam brigades? Totally 5. As for my knowledge goes, about 2 are operating in North Gaza and 3 are operating in South Gaza. So with this kind of isolation, both in North Gaza and South Gaza, obviously there is a lot of pressure on the Hamas fighters, and large number of their cadres would have been killed. Recently, just 2 days back, we were shown so much of military arsenal, ammunition, etc. has been captured. So they are getting devoid of this thing. And I think one of the panelists also rightly stated that many of the tunnels have been affected. I would not say they have been totally damaged, but affected. So therefore, their command and control structure, their military wherewithal, their cohesivity of a terrorist organization is taking a solid beating. At the same time, the Israeli forces are also suffering casualties. 102 have been dead.
In fact,
this
100 of their soldiers have died by Israel's own admission. So let me take this back to Dr. Harel Chore. Dr. Chore, I have two questions for you. Netanyahu and others in the IDF are saying Hamas operatives are surrendering in large numbers. How credible are these claims? Do you think Hamas is really on its knees at this point in the war? That's the first question. The second is, Qatar says we are still trying to work on another ceasefire for the release of the hostages. However, Israel's relentless bombardment is narrowing the window for success. Your thoughts on both these points?
Well, first, I must fully agree with the analysis of Major General Meston. I think it gives a very good picture of what is happening at the moment. To say on its knees, I don't know. It's too picturesque. It's not yet the situation, but make no mistake, they are in a very severe situation. You know, on a normal day, the North comprises something like 40% to 50% of Hamas military power, and it's almost gone. It's almost gone, and I don't see that in the south they will be able to sustain their capabilities for a long time. You know, Nia, there's another point that we didn't mention, and it's always a factor in Israel military mind these days, and not just the military actually, which are the kidnaps. And the kidnaps are a very soft spot for Israelis and military operations in particular. And, you know, it was, we can say with a lot of confidence that all those tunnels, all these $billion tunnels would be destroyed already if it was not the kidnaps. And this is something, this is a factor that really both slow us down and forces the IDF to take all sorts of the technique to bypass it and still win over the Hamas. Not to mention, you know, that the whole warfare there is different. What we're getting reports about the way they're using civilians, you know, it's far more than just putting them on top of your bunker. It's people shooting behind wheelchairs. It's people shooting from a condensed crowd. So it makes a lot of things extremely complicated in terms of military advancement, but still it's achievable. What you saw in the north, all those dozens and dozens of people who surrendered, you know, today we got another video. Now they were dressed, and the reason is that, you know, if you're not a militant dressed in a civilian clothing in the north, you have nothing to do there in the north. So it's only militants, and their numbers are vast. By the way, we also learned about a new technique, which is, first of all, fighting in civilian clothes. This is not new, by the way, but they leave their weapons in all sorts of spots that, you know, were marked from the very beginning. They just move from one point to another. That makes the whole thing really, really complex. Regarding the Qatarian, you know, Qatar represents the Palestinian, the Hamas interest fully. So I take every word coming from their mouth as with a lot of suspicion. I don't think, we need to remember, Hamas was the one to blow up the ceasefire. They shot it first, and they shot it first because they said, okay, we know Israel is going to do something, so we will show our control. Because a lot of their messages, Nia, is about control. When they're releasing kidnaps from the center of town, it's a message of control. When we hear about Sinwar showing up to the kidnapped and saying you are in a safe place, it's a message of control. So also the fact that they broke the ceasefire was a message of control. I don't think they will be able to save this control in the long term.
Okay, interesting. So let me ask Lev Aaron this question. Lev, Dr. Harel Chore says, I would take everything that Qatar says with a bag full of salt, and I certainly don't blame him for his skepticism. Qatar, after all, is a country that is hosting the top leadership of Hamas, but at the same time, whether you like it or not, it's also a fact that Qatar is the country that has negotiated the release of the Israeli hostages in the past. It says it continues to work towards another ceasefire for the release of the remaining hostages, but it is Israel's relentless bombardment which is narrowing the window. So whatever skepticism you may have about Qatar, fact of the matter is you do need them for to bring back the remaining hostages. You know, Dr. Chore says it is the presence of the hostages in those tunnels that is making this military campaign that much more complicated for us. Otherwise, we would have probably blown up all the tunnels by now. Well, isn't that all the more reason why you need to listen to Qatar and show greater flexibility? Because you still do have 140 hostages who are still lying trapped in Gaza?
I do agree with you. We need Qatar. Qatar, they're really, as far as diplomacy is concerned, they are genius. Look what they did with the Taliban in Afghanistan and with Hamas next to the Israeli border. So nobody plays down Qatar. I think what Dr. Harel meant, and in this way I fully agree with him, is that even if the head of Mossad goes to Qatar and facilitate the hostages, we want more hostages back to Israel, still we treat Qatar as the enemy. Still, Qatar is the one who financed Hamas, and also Qatar is backing right now Hamas in the diplomatic arena. So it is not that we do not need Qatar, but we need to remember that those who have the hostages are the Hamas militants. It is not Qatar. And Hamas is the one that decides that it wants to do the release of the hostages via Qatar and not via Egypt or other force. So we understand the might of Qatar and their genius diplomacy, but we are deeply suspicious of Qatar.
Okay, I don't think anybody can blame you for being suspicious of Qatar, but at the same time, you do acknowledge that Israel needs Qatar, and it's interesting you are crediting them with genius diplomacy, though I'm guessing that may be a tongue-in-cheek remark, but point well taken. So let me go back to Major General Sanjay Meston at this point. Major General Meston, what about the remaining hostages? Of course, Dr. Chore is right in saying that the very presence of those hostages in the tunnels makes this warfare even more complicated, as if it was not bad enough that the Israeli forces had to navigate this labyrinth of underground tunnels. You know, I mean, we saw what happened during the Vietnam War, right? Thanks to similar tunnels. But talking about those remaining hostages, Israel does need Qatar. It does need to negotiate with players like Qatar and Hamas. And Qatar seems to believe that Israel's intransigence on this issue is making it more and more difficult to get the remaining hostages back, even as Israel maintains that this is one of their most important objectives of this war, to bring back the hostages. So how do you resolve this quandary?
See, firstly, the balance of the hostages is a very, very complex issue for the Israelis. The Israeli people also would desire that the hostages are released, and especially their closest relatives, etc., and the people of Israel. I'm quite sure even Prime Minister Netanyahu and the IDF would also desire the hostages should be either rescued or they should be released. Now, the whole complexity is that unfortunately these hostages, Israel has to do a military operation, also keeping in mind the safety of these hostages and the safety of the other Palestinian civilians. So I'm telling you, it's a very, very complex operation from a military point of view. I really sometimes feel that if as a soldier one has to do these operations, and one has operated in our own part of the country in various complex operations, but this is really too complex. Having so many civilians, your own hostages, You know, hostages are generally ones or twos or threes, maximum 10. Here you have 243. Now, balance are about 140 plus. So imagine it's a very, very complex situation, and I do not know what is going to happen. So Qatar is required. I think now more than Qatar, perhaps the role will also be played by Egypt. See, Egypt has played a role. Now the elections are just about to, I think, finish maybe in a day or two. And Sisi is again going to emerge as the uncondemned. He is going to win over. And his position now will be strengthened. So I feel somehow some things can take a turn within the next 2 weeks once the election results are declared the next week. Perhaps Egypt may be of more value because, see, let's be very clear. Where do these civilians go? The Palestinian civilians. And there is a lot of pressure on Egypt to take these civilians to Sinai. And in bargain, their economic...
Been very clear. We are not taking any refugees. They have steadfastly refused.
No, I will just state they are clear now because of the elections. But once the elections are over, things can change. Why? I'll tell you why. There's a why to that. Egypt's economy is in dire straits. The inflation is of very, very high. Their devaluation of currency has gone so much high. So therefore, what they are looking for, they are going to be bargaining for economic aid. Economic package would be given by most of the Western countries to take them temporarily in Sinai Peninsula. Okay. This possibility could happen. Whether it happens or no, I'm not aware. It's very difficult to say. But after all, as the president of his own country, where they are in the economic problems, this possibility exists, and that can be also done by the United Nations. Therefore, Israel will there get a free hand to pursue military operations if it happens. If this happens, this war will be speeded up, things will be easy. If it does not happen, then obviously the situation is going to be very, very critical. The United States pressure would be there, because I told you even Israel would like this war to finish fast. Let us not forget, it's also affecting the Israeli economy. Not only that,
it is affecting the Israeli economy, and there is a real danger that it could end up facing a multi-front war. We've been talking about how there have been cross-border exchanges between Israel and Lebanese militants. They've been attacked by pro-Iran groups against the US and allied forces in Iraq and Syria. Yemen's Iran-backed Houthi rebels have threatened to attack vessels heading towards Israel. France shot down 2 drones launched from Yemen over the weekend. So it's all happening out there. But you've given us a very interesting scenario, but I'm running out of time. So last word to you, Dr. Harel Chore. Do you see it as a real possibility? Egypt so far has been very custard in its approach that, you know, we will let humanitarian aid go into Gaza through the Rafah border, but thus far and no further, we're not going to take any refugees. The Major General says things could change in the next couple of weeks if there is a lucrative enough economic package offered to Egypt. It may just change its mind and finally agree to accept some refugees from Gaza into the Sinai Peninsula. If that does happen, that could actually be a dream scenario for Israel.
For Israel and the Palestinians as well, from the Gaza Strip. Remember, Nia, many of them have no place to go back, unfortunately. And that's that's a consideration that I think many of them will take into account while thinking about staying in the Gaza Strip and maybe suffering another round of violence. Hopefully it won't happen if Hamas will indeed be eradicated. But I must say, again, I fully agree with the Major General. I think things are changing. I hear different voices. And maybe part of it is an Egyptian understanding that at least some of the refugees, they won't be able to stop, you know, by hook or by crook, because the situation is that severe that you don't know what they will do in order to escape the strip via sea or other. So maybe Egypt can earn something from it in a arranged manner, which will, of course, make a huge change, I think. I agree with the Major General.
All right. Well, that is certainly an interesting scenario. Whether it plays out, We'll have to wait and see. But one thing is clear, this war has entered a critical phase. So all we can say is watch this space for more. On that note, Lev Aaron, Dr. Harel Chore and Major General Sanjay Weston, always a pleasure having you gentlemen on the show. Thank you so much for joining me on Global Lens tonight. All right, as we wrap up Global Lens tonight, let's get you the biggest story of the day from India. In a highly anticipated verdict and one with huge ramifications, the Supreme Court of India today backed the centre's move to abrogate the special status of Jammu and Kashmir under Article 370 of the Constitution. And in another equally significant order, the Apex Court has directed the centre to hold elections in Jammu and Kashmir by September next year. Reading out a majority Supreme Court judgment, Chief Justice of India, D.Y. Chandrachud, said Article 370 was a temporary provision to ease Jammu and Kashmir's merger with India. The court said Jammu and Kashmir should be put on par with other states at the earliest and as soon as possible. The Supreme Court bench gave 3 separate judgments, one authored by Chief Justice Chandrachud on behalf of himself, Justice B.R. Gavai and Justice Surya Kant, another concurring judgment by Justice Sanjay Kishan Kaul, and a third judgment concurring with the other 2 by Justice Sanjeev Khanna. Therefore, all the 5 judges unanimously upheld the presidential order to scrap Article 370, a decision that was taken on the 5th of August 2019. The court stated Jammu and Kashmir did not retain sovereignty when it joined India, and its constituent assembly ceased to exist the moment it merged with India. The court went on to say the Jammu and Kashmir Constituent Assembly was not intended to be a permanent body. It was formed only to frame the constitution. The recommendations of the Constituent Assembly were not binding on the president. The Supreme Court explained why the state continued to enjoy a special status even after its merger with India, despite the state not having any internal sovereignty. The court said when the Constituent Assembly ceased to exist, the special condition for which Article 370 was introduced also ceased to exist. But the situation in the state remained, and thus the article continued. All states in the country have legislative and executive powers, albeit to differing degrees. Article 371A and 371J are examples of special arrangements for different states. This is an example of asymmetric federalism. Jammu and Kashmir does not have internal sovereignty different from other states, the court said. Article 370 gave Jammu and Kashmir its own constitution and decision-making rights on all matters barring defense, communications and foreign affairs. Its removal ended the special status to the state. Contained within Article 370 was Article 35A, which allowed the erstwhile state to define who it acknowledged as permanent residents and gave special rights such as government jobs and owning property. The Supreme Court said it did not find it necessary to see whether the reorganization of Jammu and Kashmir into a union territory was valid, since it was a temporary arrangement until the election and restoration of statehood.
तो सबसे बड़े उच्च न्यायालय है, उसके बारे में तो हम जजमेंट नहीं दे सकते, लेकिन उसका इंतज़ार था वर्डिक्ट का, आज से नहीं पिछले 4 साल से, जब से 370 को ख़त्म किया गया था पार्लियामेंट के अंदर, उस तब से इंतज़ार था। और मुझे पूरी आशा थी और जम्मू कश्मीर के लोगों को आशा थी इन तीनों चीज़ों से, दोनों चीज़ों से, 370 और 35A से, कि यहाँ के किन हालात में स्टेट का एक्सेशन हुआ और उसमें क्या क्या चीज़ें थी और क्या क्या ख़त्म हो गई। तो अब 370 तो वो 370 नहीं है जो 70 साल पहले का था, और उस वक़्त की हिस्टोरिकल बैकग्राउंड क्या था। 35A में ज्योग्राफियाई हमारी लोकेशन क्या है और स्टेट में लैंड कितनी है, वो तमाम चीज़ें नज़र में नहीं रखी गई कि ये सिर्फ पहाड़ी स्टेट है, यहाँ लैंड एग्रीकल्चर के लिए या बैठने के लिए ना होने के बराबर है। तो इसीलिए 35A महाराजा ने लाया था। ये बहुत सारे गलत लोगों को गलत फहमी है कि ये बाद में लाया, ये महाराजा का ही लाया हुआ 1925, 1927 और 1930 का है ये कानून। सिर्फ उसको और वो स्टेट सब्जेक्ट की शक्ल में लाया था जिसकी स्टेट सब्जेक्ट है वही नौकरी कर सकता, वही ज़मीन खरीद कर सकता, और उसको ख़त्म किया जाए। तो इसकी 35 एक ख़त्म होने से भी बहुत प्रेशर हमारी ज़मीन पे पड़ेगा और हमारी नौकरियों पे पड़ेगा, और मुझे समझता है कि जम्मू में ज़्यादा पड़ेगा कश्मीर के बजाय, क्योंकि वहाँ भी लोग डरते हैं ज़मीन खरीदने से भी और नौकरी करने से। तो इस चीज़ को ध्यान में।
Well, that was a big story today here in India. That's all the time we have on this edition of Global Lens. If you have been, thanks so much for watching. Do join us again at the same time tomorrow. Goodbye for now.